I'm just grabbing some water. It's okay.
You're good.
Okay, I started the live stream for the YouTube. Okay, I'm gonna start the webinar.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay, great. Hello, my name's Jennifer New. Thank you so much for waiting. We just had a little technical backstage difficulty. It's exciting to feel like we're actually maybe like backstage. And so tonight, I am here with Carrie Shootpels and Shelley Buffalo, and also Jason Polios at the Iowa City Public Library, who's going to be sort of DJing for us. And before we dive into this conversation tonight, first of all, I really want to thank Jason and the library for being such great co-hosts and just community partners throughout this year. This is our second to last Obermann conversation of the season. And the last one is on April 7th, and it is about neighborhood nests, which is nurturing every student together safely. This is a wonderful collaboration that came up last summer as the community was realizing what schooling would and would not look like this year. And leaders from nonprofits, local businesses, local government, and the school district all came together to start creating these very small neighborhood spaces that would support students in their learning. And so we're going to hear about not only what's happened this year, but how this model might continue into the future, even as schools reopen. So that's April 7th. So tonight, I am joined by Shelley Buffalo, who was born near the Mesquite settlement, and much of her extended family still lives in Tama County. Her own journey has led her away and back more than a dozen times, so she's kind of a self-described wanderer. She is a trained visual artist who has a long time identification with punk rock, as well as a deep dedication to restoring ancestral foods, including Mesquaki's Tama Flint corn, which I hope she'll tell us about later. And it's Shelley who appears in a lot of the publicity for this event. And those were photos that were taken after the derecho last summer. So welcome, Shelley. And then Carrie Shootpels is an enrolled member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. And she is at work on a book tentatively titled The Indian Card. Carrie is currently a fellow of practice in the UI's Public Policy Center and a faculty lecturer in the Rhetoric Department. She directs the Iowa First Nations Summer Program, an academic camp held at the University of Iowa, and is the vice president of the UI's Native American Council. And from 2009 to 2016, she was a homelessness policy advisor in the Obama administration. Carrie is a trained storyteller and teaches digital storytelling at a variety of levels. So welcome both of you. As one thing that we are eventually going to be discussing, and I sense probably is also bringing certain, some of our guests here tonight, is around the land acknowledgement, and Carrie was part of the writing of that. Carrie, could you begin by reading the land acknowledgement?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. The University of Iowa is located on the homelands of the Chippewa, my screen changed, of the Chippewa, Iowa, Kickapoo, Menominee, Miami, Missouri, Omaha, Osage, Otoe, Ottawa, Ponca, Potawatomi, Sac and Fox, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, 3 affiliated tribes, and Winnebago nations. The following tribal nations: Omaha Tribe of Nebraska and Iowa, Ponca Tribe of Nebraska, Sac and Fox of the Mississippi and Iowa, and Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska nations continue to thrive in the state of Iowa, and we continue to acknowledge them. As an academic institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the sovereignty and the traditional territories of these tribal nations, and the treaties that were used to remove these tribal nations, and the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution since 1847. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding the historical and current experiences of Native peoples will help inform the work we do. Collectively, as a university, to engage in building relationships through academic scholarship, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment and retention efforts, acknowledging our past, our present, and future Native nations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Jason, thanks for sharing that. So this Obermann conversation, and I should say this series, is intended to bring members of the community and campus experts together for around shared topics of passion and expertise. And I can't think of two better people to bring together than Shelley and Carrie, who I actually thought knew each other, and we were well into a very, very lively conversation of planning this before I realized they had never met. So at any rate, I reached out originally to Carrie because of this relatively new land acknowledgement. Carrie, when was it actually, remind me when it was made public?
On Indigenous Peoples Day last year, so October of 2020.
Okay, and knowing that there was a lot of interest in it and a lot of questions, and then as we began to talk and brought Shelley in as well, what has really come about is a conversation about belonging. And so bear with us, we will get to the land acknowledgement, but we're sort of approaching it from a broader perspective of what it means to belong to a tribe, a nation, to a place, to land. So Carrie, if we could start with you and with your book project and the Indian card. And if you can first tell us what is an Indian card and what is your relationship to that specific document?
Sure. And I should mention the term the Indian card is my own. So most Native people would probably know it as an enrollment card or some sort of enrollment document. I guess I'll just start with how the idea came about, which was I was digging through my old wallet, trying to put my old wallet into my new wallet, as I'm sure many of us have done before. And out popped all these cards I hadn't used or seen in months. And one of them was my tribal affiliation card. And I sort of took a moment to look at it and noticed that it had an expiration date. And the expiration date was coming up. It was within a matter of months. And I thought, I wonder what I would need to do to renew this. I hadn't really thought that it would expire. And so through the process of learning about what it was going to take for me personally to renew my enrollment card, it brought up a lot of questions about identity and how do we define identity. Native people are so used to having to defend their identity. And I think part of that is formalized and institutionalized by this concept of blood quantum and enrollment and certificates in a way that people who identify not as Native, but as any other group don't have to ever think about. My father is German, and I've never once had to think about my German enrollment card, right? And so there's this sense of identity that exists for Native peoples that goes so far beyond what most Americans will ever have to think about. And I think that there's just something really fascinating about that idea of constantly having to defend and protect your own identity. Spoiler alert, I did pass my enrollment test. So I did get my tribal enrollment renewed. But even the process of taking a test seemed quite strange to me. And that's not a dig on my own tribe, which is the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. Every tribe has a different set of parameters under which they define membership. And I think it's kind of fascinating to look across the spectrum of that and think about, how do we define identity?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What kind of things were on the test?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can share. I don't think these are national secrets. So a lot of it was place-based, interestingly. And I did not grow up in North Carolina, which is where my tribe is located. And so for me, a lot of it was non-intuitive knowledge. I imagine that someone who grew up in Pembroke, North Carolina would be able to pass the test very easily. A lot of it was sort of, what are the schools here? What are the churches here? What is the so-and-so and the so-and-so? Some of it was historical, naming former tribal chairs. And so it was clear to me that the intentionality was good, which is, do you have a meaningful connection to not just the place, but the history of the place? I just don't think I ever envisioned having to take a test on such a deeply personal thing. And I think that's a relatively unique concept. Certainly not all tribes have such a test.
Yeah.
But there are different ways that we conceptualize identity in that way too.
It's interesting to me. A friend of mine moved to the Netherlands like 5 years ago, and in taking the test to stay there, there were all these lengthy questions, and one was along the lines of, what would be the appropriate thing to bring as a guest to a neighbor's dinner party? And that would then prove how well you knew the culture there. So yeah, so these questions of, do you belong here, are kind of universal to some extent. Could you tell us more about blood quantum and where that came from? And I do know, as you just alluded to, it's used differently by different tribes.
Blood quantum is one of those unique, it's sort of like in COVID, all of us have suddenly become aware of this term synchronous and asynchronous, right? Blood quantum is one of those concepts that almost any Native person will know. And I would guess most Native people don't know about. And it's just the idea of how much of your blood can you directly trace back to however your tribe in particular defines its own membership criterion. So it's usually when the census first determined who was quote unquote Indian, and how much of your bloodline can you trace back to that? So as you can imagine, as people have married non-Native people, each generation has, divided by half, I suppose. Each generation has less and less blood quantum. Most tribes would consider 25% blood quantum to be part of the enrolled group or membership. But even that is different. There's not really one standard across the board. Some tribes will consider any native blood, for example, some won't. So it really depends. I like to always remind people that there are over 550 native tribes in this country, and they're all different. And so, often what we think of as a monolith is quite diverse.
So, Shelley, I just wanted to ask you a few questions from this perspective of the Mesquaki. So I've been listening to interviews, for example, with people who are members of coastal tribes, where it's a matter of, do I have access to the resources of, this certain like fishing area? And, to perhaps up in Alaska to whaling and so on. And And as the member of a tribe, when you have then access to its various resources, what does that mean as a Meskwaki? So I'm asking that partly as another member of this middle of the country place who, we're in farming land. And so having access to your community's resources, what does that mean from a Meskwaki perspective?
Well, first off, Meskwaki, like a lot of folks aren't familiar with the fact that Meskwaki, the tribe owns this land. It's right around 8,400 acres presently. It started with 80, and I believe that was 1853 or it's 1857, somewhere around there. I'm terrible with numbers sometimes. And so they purchased those first 80 acres, and it's grown since then. So we are a settlement. We are not a reservation. And that has afforded us a certain level of autonomy, more so than other tribes. And one of the unique things too, is that a lot of the reservations were, and I'm trying to remember what year that was, where I believe it was the Dawes Act that divided up reservations into individual family allotments. And then what happened was there was a huge loss of land during that allotment period. Because
the Dawes Act was 1906. I just happened to read that earlier today. So
thank you. Yeah. I can't store it all up here. It's so thank you for chiming in on that. So they anyway, for Meskwakis, our land is communally owned, and that's a really important. And of course, we have had, the land is in trust, so it's trust land. It's really this kind of unique situation, but still, we, like I said, that autonomy and tribal sovereignty, we've been able to maintain that. To at least to a certain extent since the original founding of the settlement. So that when it comes to access to the resources, though, like the individual must go through the tribal council in order to access land. So right now with the tribal housing program, if you are, once again, to be approved for housing, you have to go through a system and then finally have tribal council approval. But then you get a land assignment, and it's an average about, it has your house site, and it's an average of about 2 acres. But like, for somebody like me who's really interested in farming and grazing, that is a challenge, because like all of the farmland and all of the grasslands, the hayland and things like that, well, that is managed collectively with the tribal council having, the final say on that. It used to be, easier to get a land assignment. Families, usually the land assignments would be, just an understanding, like that's the Wanatee land, and which is on my grandmother's side is the Wanatees, and that is the, that's the Young Bears over there. And, back in the day, we had, in addition to our traditional gardens, families would have maybe a couple cows and some pigs and, raising some animals to supplement, to be self-sustaining, right? And this would be in my grandparents' and great grandparents' day. And so I'm digressing, but like now, of course, as as we've moved away from that, I guess that local foods model, now it's like the concept of, what do you need the land for? That's a big question, and it's like, if you need it for farming, then that farming or that ranching should be done by the tribe as a kind of, and I know this can be taken as a negative word, but the tribe, and this is true with most tribes. I talked to Dan Cornelius, who's with the Intertribal Ag Council, and we were talking about this. And he's like, well, yeah, a lot of tribes tend to manage their lands. They prefer to manage their lands as a monopoly. And when we go back to the Dawes Act, we understand why, right? Because there is a danger in those individual allotments. We know how devastating that was, that land loss through allotments. So there is this, I guess, kind of, the need to really control, to have that control, and to have, any type of enterprise or any type of land use be really like in the collective. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and I think, so one question I have for you is that, given that that you're from the settlement, and as your bio says, you've like moved back and forth, and I sense that you have this kind of agricultural heart. So what really, at this point, and I think you're maybe going to be working with Seed Savers soon, if you can help us to understand your relationship to the land and the returning to it, and why it is important to you to have access, or other small scale native farmers to have that access that can be very difficult to get.
It is, and it's, and each tribe is going to have, it's always complicated. I mean, we have, each tribe is going to have a little bit different approach to it, and as well as different situations. But yeah, my heart, I've been dreaming of really living on the land, and I mean like producing food from the land, and being able to, be a part of the local food system. I'm old enough to, I guess, as a small child, experience the tail end of local foods. I was a child during the farm crisis, so that really changed dramatically during my young years. And so, I still have an attachment of that and to that. And I feel, it's just something that I gravitate towards. And I guess like the challenge is that, so, let me try to, the challenge is like, first off, okay, we're in middle of Tama County, Iowa. It's in middle of rural Iowa. So just in general terms, trying to get folks on board with, regenerative agriculture, local food systems, holistic grazing, all of this terminology and all of this new stuff that's actually old, because what it's all based on, it's just based on working with the ecology, just the ecology, and trying to grow food in a way that works with that and replicates that as much as possible, right? But this isn't new, it's old, but it's new again. And so since these concepts are so new and stuff, it takes time for communities to embrace them. It really takes time. So it's not just like one person like me with a bunch of ideas and inspiration is going to change things overnight. That's just not going to happen. Right now, the tribe is looking to take all of their tillable acres out of production because it was monocropping with, the chemical management, GMO crop, that typical GMO monocropping system.
Mhm.
And they're taking all of that out. And I think the last time that I heard, they're planning on putting it into CRP, right? Like for me, who's really into regenerative agriculture, I'm like, well, that's an old technology. But at the same time, that doesn't mean it's bad, right? That's an old technology of stewarding the land in a more responsible way.
And can you just briefly translate CRP?
CRP is, no, I can't. What is CRP? Conservation. What is it, Jennifer?
Renewal and preserve. I'm not sure.
But it's basically it's planting it back to prairie,
Okay.
and resting the land,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And and I don't know if you can do it with forestry too, if you can plant it to trees or not. I've just seen folks, plant it to prairie and
Thank you.
yeah.
Conservation reserve programming.
Yeah. Thank you, Carrie.
And before we move on, I mean, I think we can talk in the question section a little bit more about agriculture, but can you talk specifically about Tama Flint corn and just tell us about that?
Sure. So Tama Flint corn, well, Tama Flint is the common name for our Mosqua corn. And so we have had this seed for easily over 3,000 years. And it's one of the seeds that Mesquakis have kept. I've been involved with some seed rematuration projects that have brought some seeds back to the community. But this seed, this Tama Flint corn, we never went out of practice. So we have been growing this seed out every year for over 3,000 years. And it is there is like a couple of different ways that we process the corn. We pick green corn and process it one way. We also allow the corn to mature, and then we let it dry for seed. But we also use that corn as a food source. So we have a few different ways of processing it and then preparing it for food. And it's really just vital and to our tribe's spiritual life, and of course our connection to our ancestors, and it's vital to our nutritional health too. We've had one of the indigenous chefs that had come down to help us with some community meals here. She put it this way, is that we have cell memory for this food. We have this 1,000 relationship spiritually, and the stewardship of it, as well as like nutritionally. So it's a cell memory. We have this genetic relationship with this corn. And here, even now in 2021, Mesquakis still measure their wealth by how much corn that they were able to grow and process and put away for the year. We're still we still really, when I told my aunt that I have plenty of corn and don't hesitate to ask, she was just like, well, don't tell anybody else, because you're my you're my main supplier,
You're my
so
go-to.
yeah.
Well, and part of what I so appreciate about that is, as we think about land acknowledgement, I feel like, so much when I hear the land acknowledgements, and I think many of us have started hearing these on a regular basis when we're attending various Zoom meetings with people all over the country. And I always hear them very much as this list of people. And yet it's so interesting to, it's a land acknowledgement. And Shelley, what you're sharing right there is so much, I mean, this 3,000 year relationship with this specific seed that is planted in the land, so bringing us back to the land, I really appreciate, that connection. Carrie, could you just tell us a little bit about the land acknowledgement process? Like, when did the Native American Council begin this journey?
I can try. It actually precedes me. So I came to the University of Iowa in 2018, and the process was already underway. So it was a years-long process. Part of that, I think, was, what was really important to our leaders here in the Native community at the University of Iowa was the consultation process, and reaching out to the Native communities that have a stake in this, right? I mean, from the land acknowledgement itself. And so making sure that the verbiage was the way that we wanted it, but also making sure that it fit the needs of all of the communities that we were consulting with. So it took a while. I mean, we worked on it for a couple of years after I got here, and then it was released this past October on Indigenous Peoples Day. And so, it's what we like to say is that it's a working document, right? I mean, it's very possible that it changes and evolves. Acknowledging that, I think that sometimes as a Native person, it's easy to feel relegated to the past. There's this like antiquated sense, culturally speaking, but it's so important for people to remember that there are Native people here today, right? I mean, it's alive and well and present. And just like that, the land acknowledgement is alive, and it's a living and breathing document.
Well, and within that, like, as we were talking about it, you noted how many of those listed in the document no longer are located in Iowa.
Yeah,
And
so there are 67 tribes that are part of this group that we call the Iowa First Nations. And those would be tribal communities that have at one point called Iowa home or had some meaningful connection to the state. 67 probably sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. And so I think that number always really surprises people when they hear it. The tribes and communities that are named in the document, clearly we're not naming 67. But what was particularly important to us was the consultation with the communities that either are still in Iowa or have trust lands still in Iowa, of which there are 4 of those.
And I believe, am I right, that 3 of the 4, it's their trust land is in the form of a casino? Is that?
That's the land, right? So that they have a casino that sits on the trust land.
Okay.
It's communities that are kind of right on the border of Iowa. And I think that that's probably a product of state borders are in some ways not that meaningful when you really stop to think about it. And so you have tribal communities that are, aren't defined to one particular United state. And so if you look at a map of where those communities are, you'll notice that they tend to be right on the border.
Right. Okay. And as we were talking about this, one question that came up that I thought was really interesting was both of you noting with regard to land acknowledgements of who are they for? And I'm curious if you might both reflect on that. Who are they for, and what does that question even mean?
I would love to share that one of my favorite pre-conversations we had was when Shelley and I both tried to remember the first time we had heard a land acknowledgement. The first time I heard one was at the Rhetoric Society of America conference at the University of Maryland, which is about as academic as you can get. And it was about 3 years ago. So, you know, the concept itself is not an ages old concept of land acknowledgement in that way. Of course, tribes and communities have been acknowledging the land forever. But in terms of having sort of a written document that starts a meeting or a conference, I think that that idea is somewhat new. And I personally really wrestle with it, to be honest. I think that what we always try to communicate from our Native community here at the University of Iowa and the Native American Council is that a land acknowledgement is good, and it's a step in a process. It's part of a larger puzzle. And so the hope and the suggestion is that a land acknowledgement not be the only way that you're engaging with issues of Native sovereignty and Indigenous rights. I mean, the hope is that you're exploring these issues in a lot of different ways. My fear is that the land acknowledgement becomes an endpoint rather than an opening to a conversation. What's been really interesting is the amount of people and organizations that want to talk about the land acknowledgement. I've been trying to use that as my foot into the door to bust the door open and say, while we're here, let's talk about how we get more Native students to the university, right? Let's talk about all of these other issues that every day we're talking about in our small Native community. That we would hope we could sort of increase the amount of allies for.
Shelley, do you?
Sure. I'm sorry. I was just taking it all in.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carrie. It's funny because it was about, it's like Carrie, it was about 3 years ago when I first heard about land acknowledgement. And I had taken the place of somebody else that was asked to do the land acknowledgement for WFAN, which is Women, Food, and Agriculture Network, for their annual conference. And that young lady was leaving the position that I was coming into. And so she said, "Hey, you go do it. You'll be great." and I did it, and I didn't know what a land acknowledgement was until way after, actually. So the opening the conference, like what I talked about was very different from a land acknowledgement. And it was one of my coworkers was there, and Reagan, and I guess Reagan was just kind of tickled by the whole thing. And it's like land acknowledgement is like Carrie said, it's a good starting point. But, organizations that open with that also really need to understand that it's a start, that it is not something that, is really holistically addressing the issues at hand, and representation and inclusion of Indigenous peoples, and especially the representation, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done, to make sure that these organizations that are seeking to be allies and that are on their own, really doing some great work, but that kind of have this blind side, right? And the land acknowledgement can kind of make that blind side worse, because they do it and they're like, okay, we did it, so we can feel good about that and move on with just our agenda, and not, you know, and maybe assume that that was inclusive enough. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you. I think we could start to take some questions from the audience as we come into the final 15 minutes or so. An interesting question here, and I actually, via Carrie, listened to a really great podcast about blood quantum. So this question pertains to that. And I think it was the NPR code switch. So if you just Google code switch blood quantum, this brief podcast comes up that relates to this question, which is, does the blood quantum discourage people from marrying outside of their Native American heritage?
I read the question and I've had, a few seconds to ponder it. And the first thing that came to mind was, I imagine in a lot of communities, Native and otherwise, there's pressure to marry someone who looks like you. I think the difference in the Native community, perhaps, is that there is this formal institutional notion of identity that comes along with that. And there are ramifications for it in a way that feel very formalized. I don't think that probably answers the question in totality. I have not had the experience, so I certainly can't speak from lived experience, but I'm certain that yes, it probably has discouraged people from marrying outside of the Native American community, which I think happens all the time in every community. I think the difference is that there is this thing, there's this paper thing that exists.
Yeah, and within that podcast, for example, it begins with somebody who is looking for a donor, a sperm donor, who is going to have a child on her own, and needs somebody with a certain percentage in order for her child to be then considered part of the tribe. And she likens it to well, if you were having a child with somebody from a different country and somehow could not have citizenship in the United States, it's very much a citizenship question. So it was very interesting.
Yeah. But if I can chime in on that too, definitely at Meskwaki, I mean, it's, I've taken a break from Facebook for that reason, because in some of our tribal forums, there's a lot of conversation about that. And sometimes it's really, often for me, it's upsetting, because here at Meskwaki, it's enrollment is only on the father's side. So my father's Meskwaki and my mother is not, but I'm enrolled. And then on my paperwork, I am listed as 50% blood quantum. There are folks who are 0.75% blood quantum Meskwaki, but it's flipped, where their mother is the one who's enrolled, and their dad is half, but half on his mother's side, not his father's side. And so their children aren't enrolled. Their children that have more, what we call blood quantum than me can't be enrolled. And so it's, it's, young women are reminded, be careful of who you choose, because depending on who you choose for your partner means whether or not that we're talking about land access and access to resources, housing, all of that stuff, then that's where the line is drawn. So that definitely, oh yes, that's a good question. It definitely puts a lot of pressure and for Mesquakis, especially on the young women and their choices.
Mhm. Yeah, and that the way that paternal or maternal lineage comes into that is a very interesting issue. As the mother of two kids who are Jewish on their father's side, but not recognized as Jewish because I'm not Jewish, So yeah, it's very interesting. A question from Chuck Connerly is, should Native Americans who have been in Iowa, such as the Iowa, or who are currently in Iowa, be eligible for naming rights for the use of names like Iowa or Hawkeyes?
Well, Carrie, you want to take that one? I'm naming rights. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know Chuck. So Chuck,
Okay.
I will say to you, I don't know really what you mean by that. I'm not 100% sure what naming rights means. Does that mean that you would profit off of the name Iowa or like a trademark around the university?
I'm not sure either. That's kind of what it sounds like. That's my sense of naming rights from other uses of it in a more capitalistic kind of way. Yeah.
Mhm.
I
But
mean, yeah, we could go down a rabbit hole here. I'm currently in a little bit of a Facebook battle with a company that's called Native, and they sell deodorant.
Uh-huh.
And they have no meaningful connection to a Native community. I mean, it's just a microcosm. There are so many things you could think about in that space, right?
Mhm.
yeah, and yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Carrie, because that definitely, I have seen that, whether it's, there's some companies, I think Kickapoo Coffee did change their name,
They changed their name.
and
Yeah.
yeah, they did, because, and they did it understanding that, that they didn't have rights to name their coffee company that. And I think that's out of Iroquois, Wisconsin, Kickapoo Coffee. Do you
Yeah,
think?
they're called Wonder State now, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, they are. But yeah, that native deodorant and different lines, different product lines like that are capitalizing. It's funny, like when Standing Rock finally became national news, right? I saw, like, when I was going to J.C. Penney to get something for my kid, we saw all these T-shirts that had kind of ripoffs from the Standing Rock. Some of the artists, the T-shirt and apparel lines that came out of Standing Rock artists who were trying to raise money for the movement, right? And then it was repeated and put on T-shirts and stuff, and Native and all this other stuff from J.C. Penney. So even Iowa has a the outline of the state, and it says Native on it.
Right.
And I've
Yeah.
always been troubled and bothered by that.
Oh.
But it's like, because it's definitely, it's branding, it's marketing, and it's monetized. Somebody is profiting off of it, and it is problematic. But like, can Carrie and I police that? Like, we're gonna.
If only, Shelley, if only we had that power.
From Lucy Lorian, I don't mean to be just totally choosing everybody from the urban and regional planning, but would it be appropriate to think of quantum and IDs, tests, et cetera, as white concepts used as devices to protect against whites who may want to claim native resources?
So the concept is colonial in nature, right? I mean, that's where it came from. So certainly, yes. It just depends. Is every community that's using blood quantum doing it out of a protection in that way? Probably not. But I think it probably just depends on the community you're talking about. I think what's really interesting, and I'll go back to the podcast that I shared with Jen, is this idea of what would you do if it wasn't blood quantum, right? Like, how would you measure or attribute identity. And I think that those are really interesting ideas. The challenge here is that the elephant in the room is that blood quantum and all of the things that Shelley just talked about in the Meskwaki community, it's important not just for your sense of belonging and identity. It's important because often there are really real and meaningful things attached to it, like resources, like land rights, like money, like,
Housing.
housing. And so that becomes the real crux here, is that when you're attaching some resource, some like real resource to this identity of how much blood quantum do you have, it's bound to get messy. And I think there probably is a better way, but unfortunately that's the system that was set up when Native nations and tribes were stripped of their sovereignty and land. It's that here are some resources we, the government, will give you in small quantities, and you have to somehow determine how you're going to allocate them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A more agricultural based question from Diane Platt. And this actually gets to something I'd wanted to ask you about, Shelley, is that there are a few different farms at the settlement, I believe. I think there's maybe a larger one, Red Earth Gardens, is that and then maybe one that is an Elders. You can correct me, but her question is, she's curious to know more about Red Earth Gardens, your work with Seed Savers Exchange and rematriating seeds. Could you speak about food sovereignty initiatives in Iowa?
Okay, so, well, first off, Red Earth Gardens is a tribally owned and run enterprise, and it is a organic vegetable production farm. So you could compare it to, gosh, I'm trying to think of some of the ones down in Grinnell. Like we have so many local organic vegetable production farms. Like, sorry, I'm just not thinking of any names right now, even though I've been to these farms before. But so Red Earth Gardens does not, grow like the Tama Flint corn, and they do grow like squash and pumpkin varieties, and they were doing beans. They're not doing beans right now. It just kind of that shifts as far as like what the community really wants from them. They were especially successful with the chickens and providing pasture raised eggs to the community through those chickens, but derecho pretty much wiped that out, so they're rebuilding. They're also Red Earth Gardens also has a relationship with the casino, so the casino takes a certain percentage of the greens, for example, grown at Red Earth Gardens, and Red Earth Gardens takes the compost from the casino, and they're currently working on building a composting operation. But all of this is like the Meskwaki Food Sovereignty Initiative was started in 2012. So it is a very new program. It's not, and it's still evolving and developing. So Red Earth Gardens came out of Meskwaki Food Sovereignty Initiative, but now Red Earth Gardens it's still within a department, but it's its own entity. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but MFSI, Meskwaki Food Sovereignty Initiative, the main focus of that program is ancestral foods. So our corn, our beans, our squash, and then there's other foods in there, which includes hunting, fishing, foraging, our medicinals. It's not just corn, beans, and squash, but that's the main ones that we grow. And so that's the program that has partnerships with the Chicago Field Museum it's a seed rematriation partnership, as well as Seed Savers Exchange, ISKN, which is Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, and then NAFC, which is Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. Sorry, there's just a lot of, and I hope I got all those right, but ISKN has been, and especially Rowan White has been the person that has facilitated the seed rematriation through Seed Savers Exchange, and not just with Misquamippi, but with tribes across the nation. So I have, I just got back home this afternoon, and I was up in the Decorah area visiting farms, meeting people and stuff. And so I took a bunch of squash with me, winter squash. And because I really love this variety, but it's Taos Pueblo Hubbard squash. And I grew it out in my garden this last growing season, and it did beautifully. It's a beautiful keeper. Like, it's still keeping amazingly, and it's delicious. And so I gifted people the squash, and everybody I gave it to, you know, I'm trying to impress upon them how special it is. So it was through Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. It was rematriated to the Taos Pueblo. And so, you know, anybody interested in looking that up, just you can Google Taos Pueblo Hubbard, and then ISKN, and then also Rowan White. If you're interested in seed rematriation, ISKN and Rowan White are, you know, that's the organization that she stewards, and she has done a ton of work in the area, and she does serve on the board of Seed Savers Exchange too, as well as Sean Sherman, who is the sous chef. So there's these, you know, just amazing connections and these networks of people who are, you know, as there's so many, you know, we really do need to work to get our seeds back, the ones that we have fallen out of practice of using, you know, through so many, you know, hundreds of years of displacement and, you know, loss of our land. We did keep many of our seeds with us, but some of them, you know, and especially those varieties, as if you think of like the last 50 years of the 20th century, when the food system really changed from local foods into more of the convenience foods, right? The processed foods, like growing out 5 varieties of beans really didn't become practical anymore. But that diversity, these are our relatives, you know, and the seeds are, and that diversity is really important, because some of these plants are going to do better in certain seasons than others, because we're faced with climate change right now. And so we're not going to, from season to season, you know, we need more diversity to help to be resilient in our food system.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'll also note is Rowan White, which is ROWEN, I believe. Yeah. There's a wonderful podcast that actually got me very aware of and interested in seed rematriation with her. And the podcast is called For the Wild. And so she was the guest sometime this past summer, and it's a terrific conversation with her. I think we'll do one more question. We started late, so we can, is that okay, Jason? Okay. So I'm going to kind of combine. There's understandably kind of questions about that are more or less like perhaps land acknowledgements are a first move and maybe they're not perfect. What do you both hope might be the next step? And I know, Carrie, you already mentioned, you know, using that as a way in the door to, but are there other ways of that maybe kind of formal acknowledging but that you hope that we might be growing toward?
I guess because I've spoken sort of from an institutional perspective, and that being the university, I think about this often in from the perspective of students and the university and college. And so I would love to see us make college more accessible to Native students. We spend a lot of time, maybe not a lot, but we spend time at the university reading a land acknowledgement, which is fine. I would love there to be more Native students in the classroom. And there are a lot of barriers that exist to accessing college, university, community college, et cetera. And one of those is, of course, tuition. We currently give in-state tuition to any student who's from one of those 67 Iowa First Nations tribes that I mentioned earlier, which is a good start. It's still expensive, and it's not every Native student, of course, and there are many other factors at play. And so I think there's a lot that we could do to increase Native enrollment, frankly, and also increase, let's not stop at Native enrollment, certainly. I mean, certainly diversity in all its forms. So that's just something I think a lot about. And so the degree to which we can make opportunities more accessible to Native people, and in this case, Native students, I think is great.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. I'm sorry, I'm taking notes just because I'm, as I'm listening to you, I'm just like, yeah. I think one thing about universities is that land grant universities, now we definitely, the research has shown that there are many land grant universities whose wealth came out of stolen land, right? Like directly. And so that really, when we're talking about the barriers to Indigenous people in higher education, it's like, it's to me, it's a no-brainer. It's like, it's time for reparations to be made, and in a really meaningful way. And I think the other thing, as far as like with my passion for food and agriculture, local foods, what I hope will, and I know that it's happening because I'm engaging with people, in a number of organizations that are making this happen, but that removing the barriers to entry level into agriculture, into local foods. Like real estate prices are not going down. Land prices are not going down. Land is, I see these articles about how much land in Iowa Bill Gates owns. We have folks that aren't even from this state speculating on land, and that's been going on for a long time. And so, how do we get people who, Indigenous people who are, want to live on the land and want to be part of a local food system? How do we help them to get there? So there's all of the organizations, and they're really good organizations out there that I think really could do more as far as the inclusion, the representation, and the diligence and the intention of really working towards improving that access, right? So that's like and really being allies in overcoming those barriers, because we're the marginalized within the marginalized here. We're so yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. I could keep talking with both of you for the next hour easily and beyond. But I really appreciate your time, and it's been a pleasure. So Thank you. And thank you to our audience for showing up tonight. It was wonderful to have so many people here. And again, Jason, also, I really appreciate your help with this. So,
Thank you.
yeah, good night.
All right. Good night, all.
Good night. Take care.
Good night. Yay, Shelley.
Carrie, are you still there?
I think she went off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was glad we were quickly able to overcome that, because I was just desperately searching for the link, and I thought it would just be there, and
I've been in the same situation. I understand.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for your patience and
Yeah.
and getting on the phone with me so we could like really quickly get it figured out.
And I wrote down the name of the squash. Like while you were talking, I was like,